I wanted to write a book that I would want to read.
Yeah.
So the book that I would want to read would be intellectually sound and coherent and plausible. It would be scholarly enough to be taken seriously, but it would be light enough and entertaining enough that a general reader would pick it up who knows nothing about psychoanalysis or surgery. I read this through my long experience of seeing patients, and as you allude to, there was a great deal of irresponsible behaviour and treatment went on, which nobody writing within the psychoanalytic tradition called out.
Yeah.
So this book was a sort of perfect confluence in a way of my background as a doctor. I was able to bring that to the story.
Welcome to Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality, a podcast, the name of which I'm quite proud. And I'm here with Seamus O'Mahony. I've just finished a book that Seamus has written. It's got a fantastic title. I think, to confess my own superficiality, that might have been what initially attracted me to the book. And I wanted to have him on. I think it's a really quite unique book. I can't think of another book like it. So we'll get on to that, but I'll ask Seamus to firstly correct any pronunciation that I've got wrong, and secondly to otherwise introduce himself, and then we'll start talking about the book and where he decided he was interested in its subject and so on. Over to you, Seamus.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And you've got the pronunciation of my surname spot on. Very often people say Mahoney, but you have it absolutely right. I can't see you at the moment, by the way, but I don't know if that matters.
Oh.
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
That's interesting. I can see. I think everything's fine.
Okay.
I think everything's fine. Let's press on. Let's press on.
Okay, so I guess you'd like to know where I got the idea from the book.
Well, first, why don't we hang on? Can you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Good. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Right.
The book is about is about the origins of psychoanalysis, or the early days of psychoanalysis. But that you wouldn't imagine you were, if you read your previous books, you wouldn't imagine you were about to write a book on that. So perhaps you can take us through a bit of that.
Okay, I mean, my background is in hospital medicine, and I worked as a gastroenterologist for many years. Gastroenterology, as you probably know, is that branch of medicine which deals with stomach, bowel, liver disease. I graduated from medical school in Cork in Ireland, my native city. And I spent quite a long time working in the UK, initially in Scotland and then in England. And I came back to Ireland in 2001. I stopped practicing hospital medicine just before COVID arrived, nearly 4 years ago. I'm also a writer. I suppose I came to writing relatively late. So I've written 4 books, the first of which is called The Way We Die Now, which was published in 2016. So that's that'll be coming up to 8 years in the spring. And I guess that book is about contemporary attitudes to death and dying through the prism of my own experience as a hospital doctor, but written for a general, not a medical readership. The follow-up to...
I'm going to start asking you a few questions about this. We'll make a leisurely way to the book that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So you're starting towards the end of your practicing career in the hospital, you're starting to write books. So, and as you say, you got to that late. I'm interested in that. I mean, I'm interested in, was this, do you feel that you kind of decided to become a writer and managed to make that transition over 10 years or something like that, starting with trying it out while you were working, or did it sort of come to you as these things that you had to write about? How much of this is premeditated? You'll now presumably think of yourself as a full-time writer.
Yeah, I think of myself as a writer. Yeah. Well, it started slowly and organically. I didn't wake up one day and said, I am going to be an author. Like most things in life, you try things out. My start more than 10 years ago was with an online literary magazine called the Dublin Review of Books. And I began contributing there more than 10 years ago. Longish essays, mainly on health, medicine, science, but not exclusively so. And I think that gave me the confidence that I could do it. I got feedback from people saying, well, this is quite good. And it gave me the confidence to continue. Now, the book about death also arose somewhat organically as well, in that I gave a talk to a conference of intensive care doctors about death and dying in acute hospitals and the challenges and difficulties therein. And I remember putting a great deal of effort into this talk. And I was the last speaker on the last session, and most of the delegates had left at that stage. And I gave my talk to
with your dying speech about dying.
Yeah, I was dying. But on the drive home, I thought, well, I've put a lot of effort into this, and I wonder if I could expand this into some form of essay for a general readership. And when I started writing it, it occurred to me that this would have to be more than an essay. And as I wrote, I realized that this would have to be a book. And I wrote a first draft relatively quickly. And through my contacts at this literary magazine, the Dublin Review of Books, I found an agent and eventually a publisher. And it went off from there. So like many things in life, there was a degree of serendipity or luck or whatever. And that's how it started. But it all goes back to this Saturday morning in Dingle in West Kerry, to this conference of intensive care doctors, where I gave my talk on death and dying. So that's where it started.
Second book?
Second book came out in 2019 and is called Can Medicine Be Cured? And this is a critique of contemporary medicine, both medical research and medical practice. Much of this was informed by my own experience, both of research and my long experience of practice. And I felt that medicine has lost its way. And that was the starting point of the book. My starting argument was that
most institutions have lost their way, in my opinion.
Yes. So my starting point was that medicine experienced a golden age, which I arbitrarily defined as the 50-year period from the mid-30s to the mid-80s. And if you look at this period...
the period of Archie Cochrane.
Yeah, Archie Cochrane, evidence-based medicine, the arrival of antibiotics, the elimination of smallpox, and so on and so on. So all of the great discoveries, not all, but most of the great discoveries were made during this 50-year period. And I arrived into the profession just at the end of this period.
Of the golden age. Yeah, it's like when I arrived, just like when I arrived into economics. It was on the way down.
Yeah.
Anyway, you go on. Yeah.
So my thesis was that this golden age created a kind of a medical industrial complex and that this has now become corrupted by commercial interests, that medical research is in a very dire state. And I'm not the first person to draw attention to the systemic problems within biomedical research. But I wrote about them through the prism of a practicing doctor. So although I had done and have done, research over the years, I am not primarily an academic physician. I was a frontline clinical doctor. So I wrote about how the corruption of medical research, the hijacking of evidence-based medicine, how that worked out every day on the wards and in the clinics. And so that book got quite a lot of notice in the English-speaking world and beyond, and did quite well. And I still get asked to talk about this book. I'm going to Sweden now in a few weeks to talk about it. So the book gained quite a bit of traction internationally. It would have been informed by critiques from way back by people like Ivan Illich. I don't know if you're familiar with Illich.
I am, absolutely. Yeah.
So Illich, as you know, was an Austrian priest, social philosopher, historian, public intellectual, and he wrote this famous critique of medicine called Medical Nemesis way back in the 1970s. Yeah. So my critique would have been informed a little bit by Illich, and also by a lesser-known figure, a Czech doctor called Peter Skrabanek, who spent most of his life working in Trinity College in Dublin. But my book was, as I say, written through the prism of a doctor who's on the wards and in the clinics every day. So that was the fresh perspective that I brought to it. So I stopped practicing the day before my 60th birthday, which was the 7th of February, 2020, just a few weeks before COVID.
So COVID's coming at us.
So COVID, I was just around the corner. Yeah. I remember on the very last day asking one of my microbiologist colleagues, what's going to happen? What's happening with this virus they keep talking about? And so I had about a month of freedom before everything locked down in March 2020. And at that stage, I had already agreed with my publisher that I would write a sort of diary of a year in the life of the hospital where I worked. So I had been keeping, notes, and not quite a diary, but sort of rough jottings over the previous year. And I didn't realize when I started keeping these jottings that this would be my last year. I made a decision in October.
Why not? Why not?
Well,
I mean,
what?
Yes. So that means that your retirement from practice was a little bit, it wasn't as planned as I had thought it might be.
No, it wasn't. No, I realized towards the autumn of 2019 that I was burnt out, and there is no option within the Irish public health system to pull back and go part-time or to come off on call.
Ridiculous.
And so what I realized was that as I got older, the job was getting harder physically and every other way, not easier. So the on call was getting harder. I was getting up earlier in the morning. I was getting up in the middle of the night. I was heading towards 60 and I was exhausted. Now, I would have continued had there been an option for me to not do on-call or acute work, to downscale in some way, but that was not in any way possible. So I decided that the only way for me to preserve my health and my sanity was for me to go. So And now the reason I mentioned that is that that gave an added piquancy, I think, and significance to the third book, which was called The Ministry of Bodies, because it was my last year. So as when I wrote the book, it was looking back over a long career, and the book was written at the start of COVID, and written very quickly. And then came the current book. Now the idea for that arose through Wilfred Trotter.
I thought it might have.
Yeah. So Wilfred Trotter was.
How did you become aware of Wilfred Trotter?
I came across his name looking for something else in the archives of the British Medical Journal, and just stumbled across a piece about him, and as you do, and I was looking for something else and found him, and I began to read a little bit about him, and the more I read, the more intrigued by this man I became.
Yeah.
And what particularly piqued my interest was his connection with Ernest Jones. So Ernest Jones was Freud's biographer and closest disciple, I guess, closest acolyte. And Ernest Jones and Wilfred Trotter were intimate friends as young men and later brothers-in-law. Now, to go back one step further, I had been interested in psychoanalysis on and off for quite a while, not from a medical point of view, but as a cultural and social phenomenon. And I had written a review of a short biography of Freud by the British psychoanalyst Adam Phillips. I wrote this review perhaps about 10 years ago for the Dublin Review of Books, and this was a short life taking Freud up to his 40th birthday. And I had read quite a bit about psychoanalysis as a medical student when I did psychiatry. And it had always interested me, as I say, not from the perspective of psychiatry, but as a social phenomenon. And it had been in the back of my mind to write about it for a while. And when I stumbled across Trotter and realised his connection with Ernest Jones, it occurred to me that this might be the framework that I could use to write about psychoanalysis. Now, I should stress that I'm not particularly interested in the theory or even the practice of psychoanalysis as a therapy. I'm interested in Freud as a cultural figure, I guess, and I'm interested in psychoanalysis as a social phenomenon. And that was my starting point. I had been critical of psychoanalysis in this review that I wrote.
Just before you go on with that, as you investigated Trotter's connection with psychoanalysis through Jones, did you start to think, wow, I've really hooked a big fish here? I mean, it's such a perfect, it seems to me the actual facts that you are relating are so perfectly suited to the story you want to tell and the morals that you want to draw from the story that it's like bad fiction.
I thought this is
and bad fiction, if it's true, is very much worth hearing about.
Yeah, no, you're right. I did think I'd hooked a big fish, and because the more I found out about Trotter, the more I realised that he personified the empirical scientific tradition. And that he was
in such an attractive package. I mean, if it was Steven Pinker, I really wouldn't care too much.
Yeah. He was. But not only that, I then managed to track down his only living descendant, who is a man called David Trotter, who is a very distinguished and eminent English literature academic. He held the post. It's a very prestigious professorship, the King Edward VII Chair of English Literature at Cambridge. And I wrote a speculative email to David Trotter, telling him about my interest in his grandfather. And he replied very quickly and told me that he had several trunks of material relating to his grandfather. And he was also, of course, related to Ernest Jones.
Yes,
so
sure. Yeah.
his grandmother was Ernest Jones's sister. David Trotter invited me to his home in Cambridge, where I went towards the end of 2020 and went through all of the material, a lot of it very interesting letters, mainly between Jones and Trotter, but also with other, important figures of the day, newspaper cuttings, photographs, and so on. And I realized then that Trotter was such an intriguing figure that, and Jones indeed, in his own way, equally intriguing, that this was the perfect framework. And I went from Cambridge down to London to pitch it to my publisher, who agreed that this was an intriguing story. So that was the starting point of the book, and that's how it came about.
Yeah. So I expect that I should. I'm thinking that a listener might be a bit lost now, owing to my poor interview technique, because I should have just made sure that people know just a little bit more about the basic story, which is that you have Freud sitting around in Vienna and cooking up psychoanalysis. In England, you have Ernest Jones, who becomes his biographer and, as you put it, his bagman. And you have this man called Wilfred Trotter, who is an exceptionally gifted surgeon, but also a man of great philosophy, a person who is I've got a funny relationship with this word philosophy, because I'm not saying being a philosopher is a great thing, but being philosophical about one's life, I think, is an important thing.
Yeah.
And Trotter is that. Trotter is a very reflective, well-read, civilized, decent, humble person.
Yeah.
And Jones, Ernest Jones, who tells his audience, as quoted in your book, that he's got a bit of a thing for hero worship. Trotter is the first hero that he worships, and through the story told in the book, he rapidly loses the hero worship for Trotter. Trotter is drawn into the Freud story to some extent, but Ernest Jones makes the transition.
Yes.
Like a docking module, like the lunar module, he moves from one to the other. And the story is really this strange new discipline that Freud starts as a kind of prophet. I know enough about Freud to know that he was a kind of a disciplinarian. He wanted to found this movement, and that was really what meant that various people like Jung said, look, thanks, but no thanks, I'm going to be going in my own direction. And so Ernest Jones is perfect for this. And so I guess more of the book is about Freud and psychoanalysis and Jones, but really Trotter is always there as this foil. So that's how I would describe it. And the extraordinary thing is that it turns out that as history, that if you're a novelist, you'd want Trotter to come back into the story towards the end, and sure enough, he does. So their lives remain entangled, and Freud is there in the beginning and at the end. So anyway, that's my summary. And I want to say, firstly, I think That's a huge achievement. And one of the things I heard you say on a podcast with someone else, it's certainly in the blurb, it says, buy this book because it's hilarious, which it is. But nobody listening so far will have imagined that it's just a bunch of gags. It's not, but it's very funny. But I remember you saying that you wanted to write this as a comedy, and I want to spend a bit of time on that. So please respond to that, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about it.
Okay. Well, one of the key events in this story is the very first ever International Congress of Psychoanalysis was held in Salzburg in 1908, organized by Jung. Now, before that, all of these meetings were in Vienna with Freud and his Viennese circle. But the very first international meeting was in 1908. And both Jones and Trotter travelled from London. And this meeting was an epiphany for Jones, who decided there and then that he would devote his life to this man and to this cause, whereas Trotter was appalled and went back early to London. So there was this break there. But addressing the question of the comedy of the story, the more I read and the more I researched, secondary figures, the more comedy and absurdity I found. When I looked into, for example, Princess Mary Bonaparte, when I looked into Melanie Klein,
not just Marie Bonaparte, but her sculptor.
Brancusi, yeah. So these stories were gift wrapped and handed to me, and they were extraordinary. And the interesting thing about the psychoanalytic literature is that it's deadly serious and completely humorless, but yet many of the people, the figures involved, were primarily, if you read them, read about them, and you're not part of the psychoanalytic world, they come across as essentially comedic figures, and which they did to me. Now, Trotter certainly wasn't, and Freud wasn't, but Jones was essentially a large part of Jones was a rogue, and I think that he was lucky in the court case in 1906, where he was charged with sexual offences, to be acquitted. But Jones is essentially a picaresque figure, and many of the other secondary people who were attracted to Freud were also picaresque,
or who were born into it,
But it's also there's also, as well as the comedy, there's tragedy. So the Burlingham children, for example, I should explain that the Burlinghams were a wealthy New York family, and who came to Vienna. Dorothy Burlingham was estranged from her husband. She came from a wealthy family, as did he. She arrived in Vienna with 4 children in the 1920s. 2 of them, Mikey and Mabby, were subjected to very prolonged child analysis by Anna Freud. Anna Freud became Dorothy's life partner. And the Burlingham children, the 2 eldest, Mikey and Mabby, Mikey and Mabby, had, awful, tragic lives. One died of alcoholism. One died by taking an overdose. So there was tragedy also. There was also tragedy in the story of Melanie Klein, who also subjected her own children to psychoanalysis. Freud carried out a prolonged analysis of his own daughter, Anna, which really borders on incest, really. And so there was as much tragedy as there was comedy. And Jones, who I guess is the central figure in some way in the book, though there's more about Jones than Trotter. Trotter didn't leave a great deal behind in terms of material for me to write about. But Jones is essentially a picaresque figure. I think it's fairly obvious to any reader of the book that, you know, Trotter is my hero. I think he's everything that I would admire in a doctor. He is technically a brilliant surgeon by common consent, the greatest English surgeon in the interwar years, famously saved the life of George V. He was self-effacing, he was humble, he was called a philosopher in a profession where there are none. He was reflective, he was original, he was a brilliant aphorist, he was an outstanding teacher, and yet it is Freud who became famous. Trotter, even within University College Hospital, where he spent all his career, is all but forgotten.
His records are lost. Yes,
yeah,
it's incredible. Yeah.
So I think it was a reflection too on the nature of fame, and Trotter is there as an avatar, somebody who personifies for me what science is about. And Trotter wrote very reflectively and interestingly about medicine as a craft, not a science. And
as well as a craft, not a science, as a calling, as a fundamentally ethical practice.
Yes.
And ethical, I think people who listen to that word will think I'm speaking a little bit. I'm talking about this incredible story you tell of Archie Cochrane in the final chapter, where he holds a Soviet soldier, and that cures him insofar as he can be cured because he's dying, but he's screaming. And and Trotter, and that's what I mean by ethical. For Trotter, the care really matters. And the amazing thing is that modern science shows us that being noticed, being regarded, coming into someone else's life and counting for something for them is the way. That's the if you're trying to mobilize the placebo effect, that's the maximum placebo effect. The good effect of seeing a doctor is seeing a doctor who notices what you're saying, who acknowledges you as another, and who reassures you and comforts you, and so on. And that's all Trotter again.
That's all Trotter, and this is despite
at least your Trotter.
Yes, and this is despite the fact that, from a technical point of view, he was the most gifted surgeon of his day. But he said, or he wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, more important than any technical ability is giving the patient your entire attention. He said the interest of the doctor is more important than any procedure or any medication. And
which is a comment on the modern science of placebos.
Yeah, and he inspired many of his students at UCH, including people like Archie Cochrane, who you mentioned. But Trotter had this incredible ability to devote his entire attention to his patient and to make them feel that nothing mattered more to him than their welfare. And he never rushed them. And remember that this was a time when, consultant surgeons in London teaching hospitals were figures who inspired fear and sometimes loathing. They were personified. I don't know if you remember the doctor in the House movies, the figure of Sir Lancelot Spratt, as played by James Robertson Justice, this you know, fearsome, pompous figure. And Trotter was the very antithesis of that.
Yeah.
And he inspired, as I say, several students, most notably Wilfred Bion, who went on to become a very eminent figure within psychoanalysis. But it was Trotter who inspired Bion's approach to listening to his patients, to giving his entire attention. So it wasn't a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst who inspired Bion, it was a surgeon, and which now seems extraordinary. Surgeons have this reputation nowadays for being gruff and hurried and not particularly empathetic. Yet somehow Trotter combined technical excellence with this unshowy kind of empathy and with this intense interest in his patients. Archie Cochrane is another figure who makes an appearance in this book. Now, Archie Cochrane is regarded as the founding father of what is now called evidence-based medicine. And Archie Cochrane underwent a prolonged psychoanalysis as a young man. And it was partly this experience of psychoanalysis that prompted Cochrane to look very critically at evidence in medicine. So just to give you the background, Cochrane came from a wealthy Scottish family, went to Cambridge. Cambridge, by the way, was really entranced by psychoanalysis in the 1920s in the way that it was by communism in the 1930s. And Cochrane had a sexual problem. Now, I've spoken to some people since I wrote the book who say that it was, he didn't admit this in his memoir, but it came out after he died, that Cochrane was gay and couldn't reconcile himself to this. But at any rate, whatever the problem was, he underwent psychoanalysis in the early 1930s under an analyst called Theodor Reich. And because of anti-Semitism, Reich had to move from Berlin, where they started analysis, to Vienna, and finally to The Hague in Holland. And after 2.5 years, Cochrane realized that analysis was doing nothing for him, and finally gave it up and finished his medical training in UCH in London, where he was taught by, amongst others, Wilfred Trotter. But Archie Cochrane kept asking Reich, well, where's the evidence for what you're doing? Is there any empirical evidence that what you are doing is of any benefit for me or for anybody else? And Cochrane eventually became, I suppose, an epidemiologist. He wrote a famous book in the early 70s about the use of evidence in the National Health Service. And it was his intellectual legacy that was one of the pillars of evidence-based medicine. And his name lives on in the Cochrane collaboration, which is a huge international database of meta-analyses, systematic reviews, and so on. But it was his experience of psychoanalysis that partially inspired him down this path of evidence-based medicine.
So that's all very good to know, but I'm going to press on with this question about comedy.
Okay.
Because now is there any model for, is there any other book you can think of that writes history as comedy? Because I can't.
Well, one author...
There must be.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. I mean, one author whose work I think informed or inspired me a little is Craig Brown. I don't know if you're familiar with Craig Brown. Craig Brown is a parodist primarily, and he has written for Private Eye, which is a satirical magazine which has been going since the early 60s. And Craig Brown has been writing a regular column for them. A parody is what he's a parodist, really, by trade, and that's what he is really brilliant at. But he wrote a number of histories as comedy over the past decade or so, most famously about Princess Margaret, the late Princess Margaret. Yeah. So he, so all of these royal biographies, as you probably can guess, up to then were, you know, very respectful and reverential and hagiographical and so on. But he wrote a life of Princess Margaret essentially as a comedy. And he wrote more recently about the Beatles. Again, not quite comedy, but large portions of it were comedy. And the more I read when I was researching this book, particularly about the secondary figures, if you take figures like Princess Mary Bonaparte or Melanie Klein, it occurred to me that I could write something using this Craig Brown type approach to this story. So he inspired, I think, not so much a structure, but perhaps an attitude that much of this was comedy and absurdity. And I wanted to write a book that I would want to read. So the book that I would want to read would be intellectually sound and coherent and plausible. It would be scholarly enough to be taken seriously, but it would be light enough and entertaining enough that a general reader would pick it up who knows nothing about psychoanalysis or surgery and could read it with enjoyment. So that was, those were the things that inspired the comedic aspects of the book. So yes, I do owe a debt to Craig Brown's approach in particular.
So one of the reason, well, firstly, it struck me as an unusual thing and a very successfully brought off thing. The other thing that occurred to me is that in an age of contempt and hatred, to write against something, which is very much what you do about psychoanalysis in the final analysis, it allows you to do so in a way that is not hateful, that is not self-righteous, that is not reductive in a sense. And it also allows you, there's also, as you've already adverted to earlier, it also allows you the light and shade of the comedy, and all their children are killing themselves, and their level of irresponsibility towards their patients is spectacular. Well, as a general rule, it's very bad, and very often it's just, leaves you shaking your head.
Well, this is it. I wrote in the section about my sources that when I researched the book, my eyes were constantly popping and my jaw was constantly dropping. Yet Freud's biographers, their eyes remained unpopped and their jaws remained undropped. So I read this also through the prism of a doctor.
Their gold remains unsmacked, one might say.
Yeah, so I read this through my long experience of seeing patients. And as you allude to, there was a great deal of irresponsible behavior and treatment went on, which nobody writing within the psychoanalytic tradition called out.
Yeah.
So, so this book was a sort of perfect confluence in a way of my background as a doctor. I was able to bring that to the story. the doctor-patient dynamic, and also my literary tastes and influences. So I, as you know, do not dismiss Freud.
Yeah, exactly.
I maintain, in fact, I made a point at the very end of the book that in many ways Freud remains a great man. And to paraphrase the Wolfman, one of his most famous patients, much of what he wrote may be wrong, but it was still a great achievement. So Freud is that paradoxical figure of a great cultural figure and a great historical figure much of whose work I would regard as misguided, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he changed the world and how we think. And I don't dismiss psychoanalysis completely. Getting back to this placebo effect that you mentioned earlier, what seems to be most important in any psychological therapy is not so much the school of thought which the therapist subscribes to, but their interest in the patient and their sympathy. And I think that seems to be the important thing. And I made the point, I asked the question, does it really matter if the Oedipus complex exists or not, if the therapist finds it a useful tool? So I don't entirely dismiss psychoanalysis as a therapy.
So you quote Anthony Storr. If Freud had been content to maintain that psychoanalysis was a hermeneutic system, a system of interpretation, for those who aren't into the word hermeneutic, a historical way of interpreting human behaviour in terms of past events and influences, he might have kept his respect of scientists.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other thing, the final thing that I want to kind of explore a bit, which is this question of science. And I mean, I completely agree with that. And with what Anthony Storr has said, which is that there is an achievement in psychoanalysis, and the achievement is to begin the process, however errantly, to begin the process of constructing a system of interpretation that can... I think Freud, in many ways, he shoehorned himself into the form of a doctor, but he was really a kind of prophet, and he was trying to deepen people's... He was interested in a deeper engagement with life in some kind of sense. And that's why I think bringing up... You introduced Popper, whose theories of science appeal to what I call the schoolboy atheists in our community. I'm not a... This is not a... I'm fine with atheism, but not of the kind that I argued at primary school when I was in a school debate and said God was very like Santa Claus. You know, you get promised that if you're good, you go to heaven and so on. And that was really, I thought that was a bit of a lay down misere, and you couldn't see him and so on. Now, if you take, well, as you would no doubt be aware, Popper's claims about a way in which you can talk about a demarcation, a rule of demarcation between what is and is not science was not a success. It's not a success among, the story of Popper is a bit like Freud, which is that among people who take what he's trying to do seriously, almost all the philosophers proper don't think he failed. But of course he managed to create a mythology about what science is that's extremely flattering to scientists, and extremely flattering to people who feel the need to keep everybody else on the straight and narrow, to make sure that they're not thinking too differently to the way they're thinking. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I'm certainly aware of that critique of Popper. I mentioned him really in passing as one of the more virulent critics of psychoanalysis. But I think
no, you do more than that. You pick up his theory of science. You pick up him as as someone who has defined science, and you talk about the rules of science. And those people who think that Popper failed, which, as I say, are the majority of people who take it seriously in philosophy, think he failed precisely on that point, that there aren't rules of science, that science is a little bit like Trotter's medicine, which is to try to take the thing as seriously as possible, but it's not something that can be automated with a set of rules from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, Trotter was less prescriptive, as you mentioned, than Popper. Trotter talked about the provisional quality of science. He talked about how it must always revert to the facts. He talked about medicine rather unpompously and refreshingly, I thought, as a craft, not an applied science. And he made the very good point that an awful lot of rot was talked and still is to this day about medicine as a science, and he is absolutely right. It's a craft. And he talked about how conservatism is important in a traditional craft. Because it is conservatism that ensures the survival of knowledge in a way. So he wasn't taking this very hard line scientific approach. He took a rather different line on it, which I found very refreshing. And I think Trotter's essays could be read by doctors today, and they would learn something useful. That, yes, certainly we go to science, we use science, but ultimately what we do every day is a craft, and who we deal with are our patients. So that's what we do, and I think that was central to him. And this is despite the fact that as I described in the book in some detail, he did this extraordinary experiment on himself to refute another paper on nerve regeneration. And so he understood experimental design, scientific process, all of that. He understood all of that. He understood about replication. He tried to replicate another experiment long before people were talking about the current replication crisis in science. So he understood all of that. That experiment, by the way, gave him the Fellowship of the Royal Society when he was a young man, which was a signal and unusual honour for a surgeon, and the only honour that Trotter ever accepted. He turned down the baronetcy and knighthoods and all sorts of things for treating the king, but that was the one honour that he accepted. But it was his one and only experimental work. Everything that he did thereafter was descriptions of surgical technique, outcome and after whatever operations, very practical papers. So he viewed, as I say, medicine not as an applied science, but as a practical craft. But he understood scientific method, but understood also its limits.
Look, I think that is a fantastic landing point. I'm tempted to, well, I'm more than tempted. I'm going to succumb to my temptation, but it's a very difficult question to ask you. It seemed to, I wondered if you might sum up, but I detect I have not read your first book, or maybe it's your second book where you were talking about, or even the third one, about, I gather one of the main themes of these books is the loss of craft, the juggernaut of modern thinking, modern economic structures, both in the public and the private sector, and and I see this to me, as an economist who thinks about this stuff, virtually nobody else does, and if you are thinking about stuff like that, that people will think you're very literary or they'll think you're making some kind of I don't know, pretentious sort of point or something. And what you would, and so I wanted to just invite some sort of reflection on what, you know, you're nodding as I say these things. So
Yeah.
do your best in summing up what we've been talking about, but what you care about most, what you have written about. There you are. Over to you.
Okay. I guess I'm not alone in coming to the end of a very long career in reflecting on what it all means and what it all meant.
Yeah.
What did I learn and the mistakes I made. And I look upon Trotter in a way as a hero.
Yeah.
Because he combined excellence at the craft with a vocational commitment to his patients. He was a man who was free, who was miraculously devoid of greed and ambition for worldly things, which unfortunately doctors are prey to.
They are.
And as I look back over a career of nearly 4 decades, I think that medicine has lost its respect for the traditional craft approach to our profession, to the simple things, taking a good history, doing a good physical examination, paying attention to our patients. We've been swamped by technology, by research. We have been swamped by careerism, by greed. And I hold my hand up and say, yes, I have been swayed by all of these things, like many other doctors. But I remember as I read that essay by Trotter, where he said, more than technical expertise, more than ability, more than any treatment, what matters to the patient is the doctor's interest. And I read that sentence and I said, I wish I had known that when I was a young man starting out. Because when you're a young person starting out in medicine, you're consumed by career progression, essentially. That's what consumes young doctors. And when you get there, it's about maintaining your position, and it's about furthering your research, or it's about making money, or it's about gaining this reputation, or gaining this title of professor, or whatever. We are constantly distracted by these things, and we forget the core things. I was thinking recently also about another figure, William Osler, who is regarded as the kind of founding figure of modern medicine. He was a Canadian who established bedside clinical teaching residency programs, wrote a famous textbook of medicine. But I was writing about him recently for a journal, and it occurred to me that we've lost a great deal of what he taught and thought was important. The physical examination, the history, the giving of the undiluted attention to the patient, the practical craft. Medicine has been blinded by technology, by advances in science, many of which turn out to be chimeras and mirage, and we have neglected the core things that doctors need to do. I'm not saying that we should ignore these developments, but that they should be secondary. They should be secondary, not primary. So those are the things that I've reflected on since I stopped practicing, and which I hope Trotter personifies in the book.
Well, he certainly does, and I'm very glad I asked that last question. I think you've acquitted yourself famously. Really marvellous summary, eloquent but also deeply felt. A fantastic book, and I'm just thrilled to have recorded this conversation, and I will press stop and we can just have a chat after that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.